Henry Parkhurst by Bob K. Throughout the second half of 1938, the honor dealer's little office was abuzz with activity. The hubbub involved neither the sale of auto polish nor the organization of a buying co-op, but the production of the text Alcoholics Anonymous. Two fallen 40-something entrepreneurs viewed their new venture as an opportunity to help potentially hundreds of thousands or more alcoholics who were still suffering as they once had. And in doing so, they dreamed of solving their own economic woes. Earlier in the year, visions of paid missionaries in alcoholic hospitals financed by Rockefeller millions had vaporized when John D. agreed with subordinate Albert Scott's cautioning query, "Won't money spoil this thing?" Fancied top management positions for the two men vanished. The book was their remaining hope of large profits and social significance. The would-be publishing magnates were William Griffith Wilson and Henry Giffen Parkhurst. Their secretary, Ruth Hawk, later famously reported that AA's big book wouldn't have been written without Bill and wouldn't have been published without Hank. See Pass It On, page 195. Loyalty to her memory of these two men may have been what prompted her to add that she did not believe that either man expected to make a fortune. The motive, always, was to help the fellowship. Their original idea was to begin giving the books away as soon as possible. See Pass It On, page 195. Ruth's ingenuous remarks are somewhat countered by the history of the events. Chapter: Summer in Akron. As the summer of 1935 drew to a close, Bill Wilson was reluctant to return to New York. He and Dr. Bob had established a small core of sober alcoholics and had planted the seed with others. His proxy battle had not gone well, and dreams of a management position that would resuscitate his career had collapsed in crushing disappointment. There was safety and strength amidst his new friends. He had taken constructive action in May in the Mayflower Hotel lobby, when he was panicked by a temptation to drink. The seeking out of another drunk to work with had led to the sobriety of Akron proctologist Dr. Bob Smith. In turning his focus to the needs of the problem-laden physician, Bill had saved himself. It was with sadness and some trepidation that Bill Wilson returned to New York on August 26, 1935. Chapter: Back in New York. In New York, Bill had a support base in the Oxford folk, but it was clear almost from the beginning that Bill Wilson was not well suited to be an Oxford group member. He never shared in or had much sympathy for the Oxford group's goals. See Bill W. by Francis Hartigan, page 65. Back when he had been approached by Ebby with the news of his salvation through the evangelicals, Bill vaguely remembered having heard of them, but it was his impression that they were a bunch of Christers, rich folks mostly, all very chic and high-minded. See Bill W. by Robert Thompson, page 188. He was less than impressed with Oxford's reformed drunks. He saw Shep Cornell as a socialite. As a drunk, he was sure Cornell was a penny-waste, a man who had probably gone wild one night on too many sherries at a junior league cotillion. See Thompson, page 189. The big book promises that God will show you how to create the fellowship you crave. See Big Book, page 164. Wilson seems to have chosen to get help instead from his old friend, Dr. Silkworth, who was risking his medical reputation and career in allowing Bill to roam the corridor of towns. See Not God by Ernest Kurtz, page 43. Two of these clients, Henry Parkhurst and John Fitzhugh Mayo, got sober and joined Bill in his efforts. Although it, as yet, had no name, AA now had a group in New York City. Chapter: Standard Oil of New Jersey. Very little is known about the early life of Henry Giffen Parkhurst beyond his being born in Marion, Iowa on March 13, 1895. He is frequently described as an ex-athlete, a former football player, but whether he played college ball, semi-pro, or just high school, we are left to wonder. We do know that the handsome redhead is said to have been able to produce a good idea a minute for business. He had been a Standard Oil of New Jersey executive who was fired because of his drinking. See Henry G. Parkhurst by Mike O. At one point, Parkhurst and Jim Burwell had worked together in Louisiana. There are conflicting opinions as to whether Hank actually wrote to employers, but he definitely is the one-time assistant manager of a corporation department employing 6,600 men. See Big Book, page 136. He is also, most likely, the case of pathological mental deterioration. See Big Book, Roman numeral, page 31, who was almost unrecognizable a year later. It is known that when Bill talked to Hank at Towns Hospital, it was Hank's 10th time there. The first several sponsored by Standard Oil in attempts to rehabilitate their otherwise valuable employee. By the last trip, there was no employer. Hank is variously described as being an agnostic or an avowed atheist. His first edition story was The Unbeliever, and though he seemed willing to cooperate in prayer and the like, it is clear he never accepted the notion of a personal God. He and Jim B. led the fight against too much talk of God in the 12 Steps. See biography, The Unbeliever, Silkworth.net. The Unbeliever did embrace sobriety unquestionably. Fitz, Hank, and Bill were the three extraordinarily healthy males whose ambitions had been derailed. Now they had a new outlet, and they brought to it a wonderful young exuberance. See Thompson, page 236. Chapter: Honor Dealers. Honor Dealers seems to have been started for the purpose of extracting revenge on his former employer, Standard Oil of New Jersey. Hank's small New Jersey office soon became the operating base of what would become Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill joined Hank at Honors Dealers, but not much work was done. They were too consumed with the work. Before long, Bill and Hank began to have difficulty paying both Ruth's salary and the rent on the office. Ruth went without pay for a while, but the landlord eventually forced them out, and they moved to a smaller office. Until 1939, Bill's major headquarters was in Newark. See Pass It On, pages 192 and 193. In the autumn of 1937, Hank and Bill decided that rich people should finance their grand schemes of bringing a solution to America's alcohol problem. The two of them immediately set to work approaching every rich man and every charitable foundation in Manhattan. After 6 weeks, not 1 cent was raised. See Thompson, page 245. The rich folk had disagreed. An introduction to Rockefeller's people spawned great dreams of literature, paid missionaries, and alcoholic hospitals, but the world's richest man thought the group should be self-supporting, and a mere pittance was granted. Chapter: The Book. Bill began work on the book in March or April of 1938. Bill soon completed his personal story and the chapter called There Is a Solution. These were multilithed immediately to be used in a money-raising campaign in the summer of 1938. See Pass It On, page 193. An offer from Eugene Exman of Harper & Brothers prompted the idea in the two entrepreneurs that self-publishing would be more advantageous. Hank, whom Bill described as one of the most terrific power drivers he had ever met, convinced him they should bypass the trustees and sell shares in their company to publish the book themselves. Finally, even the trustees could not keep Bill and Hank from charging ahead on the new venture. See Pass It On, page 194. Years later, AA history has innocent Bill Wilson being dragged along in Hank's whirlwind schemes. But Bill Wilson had not fallen off a turnip truck in Nebraska. He was a Wall Street wheeler-dealer. His own authorized biographer wrote, Bill had 1,000 ideas. The stalled motor of his imagination had started to turn again. The old power drive was coming back full force. See Thompson, pages 240 and 241. Chapter Works Publishing, Inc. If there is anything more embarrassing to Bill Wilson than LSD experimentation, Ouija boards, seances, marital infidelity, and possible sex addiction, it is his role in Works Publishing, Inc. By the original deal, Bill owned a third of the book, as did Hank. Eugene Exman of Harper & Brothers had agreed, quite contrary to his own interest, that a society like ours ought to control and publish its own literature. See Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, page 155. What transpired was substantially different. Bill and Hank formed a publishing company, and 67% of the book that Exman thought should be owned by the fellowship was owned by two men. Two men insistently trying to sell the remaining 33% to supply working capital for the completion of the writing project. AA would not own its own book at all, but the Alcoholic Foundation would receive the same royalties from Works Publishing that would have been paid by Harper & Brothers. The histories describe Hank as the uber-aggressor in this project, Bill Wilson later regretting this early haste as ownership of the Works Publishing shares eventually became a sharply controversial issue. See Pass It On, page 195. Well, duh. Bill was convinced by Hank, in later retelling, to bypass the trustees who wanted the Harper book deal. The reluctance of the other alcoholics to purchase stock in a book not yet written was overcome in large part by a story of interest by the then enormously popular Reader's Digest. The words of historian Ernie Kurtz are somewhat cynical. A presumably promised, my italics, supportive article in the Reader's Digest did not come to be. See Not God by Ernest Kurtz, page 76. Stock was sold, $5,000 worth, and a loan from Charles Towns, initially for $2,500, then $1,500 more, provided the funding for Hank and Bill to finish the book. All of these funds were dissipated in advances to Hank and Bill, salary to Ruth Hawk, rent for the honors dealer's office space, and other poorly accounted for miscellaneous expenditures. Once the book had been written and edited, there remained only enough to pay Cornwall Press only a small deposit towards the first printing order of $5,000. Chapter Let's Save Everybody Who Has $60. Bill Wilson detaches himself somewhat from the decision to retail the book at the ridiculously high 1939 price of $3.50, about $60 in 2014 dollars. Some members had insisted on a $1 book. They had turned deaf ears to Henry's plea that we must make something on the deal, or else we could never operate a headquarters office, much less pay off the shareholders. But Henry finally won through. See AACOA, page 170. Kurtz says stockholders Wilson and Hank P. argued for a price of $3.50. See Not God, page 76. Of course, Hank hadn't sold dreams of paying office expenses to the investors. His charts delineated the per-share profits based on various sales projections up to the million that might occur in the first few years. The million sales number was reached, but some 30 years beyond his optimistic forecasts. Today, in spite of copyright issues and the onslaught of paperless technologies, AA's Big Book sells at a rate of 1 million copies per year. 35 million copies have been sold. Total revenues have reached approximately $200 million. Holders of 33% of that enterprise and their heirs would have fared extremely well. One can be forgiven for thinking, with all of Hank's aggressiveness and ambition, that poor Bill Wilson, owner of a 33 1/3% interest, was just being dragged along in the slipstream of the determined power driver. Of course, Wilson had swum with the big fishes of New York's financial center, and he had been through law school. He was not some Candidesque naif. Hank's son said that his father and Bill both expected to make $1 million from the project. See Pass It On, page 195. Bill did hope that income from the book would enable him and a few others to become full-time workers for the fellowship. See Pass It On, page 194. In the end, Hank, fueled by a variety of resentments, started drinking again, most likely around Labor Day of 1939. Part of Hank's unhappiness, Ruth added, involved her. Hank and I were interested in each other. I had, at one time, seriously considered marrying him. When Ruth finally decided not to, Hank blamed Bill. See Pass It On, page 228. Only a few months earlier, Hank and his wife Kathleen had taken in the homeless Wilsons when they were finally evicted from Clinton Street in April. Chapter does not play well with others. Throughout his life, Bill Wilson provoked passionate feelings in men and women. Sometimes men who had been close to him turned on him. Sometimes there were women involved. Hank began to rail against Bill, accusing him of all kinds of things, including inducing Ruth Hawk and keeping her from marrying him. Soon, Hank started to drink again. See My Name is Bill by Susan Cheever, pages 163 and 164. Male friends and colleagues like Hank Parkhurst and Tom Powers stormed off after working with him. Cheever, page 206. Chapter A New Deal. At the time of the self-publishing deal, Hank sold the New York members on the idea, and Bill convinced Dr. Bob to go along, but Smith's fear of the reaction of the Akronites left the Ohioans in the dark as to the details of the work's ownership. As the financials came to light, there was outrage, and in early 1940, Bill accepted a new deal from the Alcoholic Foundation. He and Hank were to surrender their shares to the Alcoholic Foundation. The other share buyers were to be reimbursed what they had invested. When a Rockefeller loan financed this buyout, most were delighted to be breaking even, as the book was not selling well. But Hank resisted all their pleas to turn over his 1/3 ownership in Works Publishing to the foundation. See Pass It On, pages 235, 236. One day, Hank turned up at the new Vesey Street office. Whether he was drunk and taken advantage of, as his son claimed later, or just completely broke and very shaky, Hank was persuaded to sign a release in exchange for being paid $200 for some office furniture that had previously been his. Hank's son said that Hank always felt he had been treated badly. He thought Bill had made a deal with the foundation that excluded Hank from any future share of the book's profits. See Pass It On, page 236. Bill's royalty on the big book eventually became substantial and provided Bill and Lois a lifetime income. See Pass It On, page 236. By the time of Lois's death in 1989, royalties paid to the Wilsons totaled $10 million, and Lois's legatees have received an additional $9 million. Once more, Bill's partner had received $200. Chapter: Resentment. Hank's life continued to be one of bitterness, with no happy ending. In Cleveland, he found a sympathetic ear in Clarence Snyder, who was no fan of Bill Wilson. They supported themselves with some small business-type marketing ventures. Nothing productive came of their rabble-rousing against the founder. Hank never recovered completely, although there were some occasional brief periods of sobriety. Hank and Kathleen divorced in 1939, and Hank married at least 2 other women. One of the women he married and divorced was a sister-in-law of Cleveland AA pioneer Clarence Snyder. He later married an oil heiress from a wealthy Houston family. He died on January 18, 1954, at Mercy Hospital in Pennington, New Jersey, within 2 months of his 59th birthday. See Mike O. There is much wisdom in AA's big book, not the least of which is, it's plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. Big Book, page 66. That these resentments are warranted seems not to reduce their destructive power. To some extent, our friend Hank was poorly treated, but relentless clinging to his bitterness and a return to the bottle is on him. He forgot the lessons of a book he had a great deal to do with creating. About the author, Bob Kay. Bob Kay lives in the metropolitan Toronto area and has been a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous for 24 years and an out-of-the-closet atheist for that entire time. He has been a regular contributor to the AA Agnostica website for almost 5 years, and in January 2015 published Key Players in AA History. In 2013, he co-founded the Whitby Freethinkers Meeting. The original print version of this article, Henry Parkhurst by Bob Kay, may be found on the website aabeyondbelief.com in the AA History section, dated October 7, 2015. This audio presentation was produced on February 2, 2017. For more stories, articles, and podcasts, please visit our YouTube or SoundCloud channels. Just search for